The Soviet Union controlled 1/6 of all the land on Earth. It had the largest army in the world, thousands of nuclear warheads, oil fields, gold mines, and forests that stretched across 11 time zones. And yet, in the final days of 1991, this superpower didn't fall to war. It didn't fall to invasion. It simply stopped existing. How does the second most powerful country in human history collapse from the inside out? That's what we're going to unpack. To understand the collapse, you have to understand what was built and how fast it was built. After the 1917 revolution, the new Soviet state made a radical bet. Instead of letting markets decide what got made, the government would decide everything: what to produce, how much, and where it would go. This was called central planning. Every 5 years, planners in Moscow set targets: tons of steel, tons of coal, numbers of tractors, numbers of tanks. Local factories didn't compete for customers. They had a number to hit, handed down from above, and for a while, it worked spectacularly. In barely 2 generations, a mostly rural agricultural country transformed into an industrial and military superpower. It built the bomb. It put the first satellite into orbit. It put the first man in space. By the 1960s, the USSR wasn't just a regional power. It was rivaling the United States for control of the entire planet. But here's the thing about a system built entirely for output, for steel tonnage and tank counts. It was never built to ask whether people actually needed what it was making. And that question, quietly ignored for decades, would come back to collect its debt. Behind the parades and the rocket launches, ordinary life told a different story. If you were a Soviet citizen in, say, 1975, and you wanted new shoes, or fresh meat, or toilet paper, you might wait in line for hours. Not because there wasn't a factory somewhere making shoes, but because that factory had a quota for shoes made, not shoes people actually wanted to buy. Wrong sizes, wrong styles, wrong quantities, shortages next to warehouses full of unsellable stock. This is the paradox of central planning. It's extremely good at hitting a number and extremely bad at knowing what number to hit. Worse, without competition, there was no real pressure to improve. If your factory was the only one making refrigerators in your region, it didn't matter if your refrigerators were bad. People had nowhere else to go. Innovation stagnated, quality stagnated, and where there's scarcity and unaccountable power, corruption follows. Local officials inflated production numbers to look good on paper. Goods were skimmed off and sold on black markets. Bribery became a quiet, parallel economy running underneath the official one. None of this alone was fatal. The Soviet Union limped along with these problems for decades, but it meant the system had almost no cushion left, no slack, no reserves, for when a real shock hit. And in the 1980s, several shocks hit at once. Here's something most people don't realize about the late Soviet economy. It was quietly propped up by oil. Soviet factories were inefficient, consumer goods were unreliable, and the ruble wasn't worth much on the world stage. But oil and gas, those the world did want and would pay hard currency for. Through the 70s, energy exports became the Kremlin's financial lifeline, bringing in the foreign cash needed to import grain, technology, and everything the internal economy couldn't produce well. Then in the mid-1980s, global oil prices crashed, falling by more than half in a matter of months. For most countries, that's a painful economic hit. For the USSR, it was closer to an amputation. The revenue that had been quietly patching over decades of inefficiency simply vanished. Suddenly, the government couldn't afford the imports it had come to rely on. It couldn't easily pay for the subsidies that kept prices artificially low at home. The cracks that had been forming for years were now impossible to paper over. And as if that weren't enough, the Soviet Union was already bleeding money somewhere else entirely. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, expecting a quick, decisive campaign. They got a 9-year quagmire instead. Soviet forces found themselves fighting a grinding guerrilla war against Afghan insurgents, many of them backed, funded, and armed by the United States and its allies. The war dragged on year after year, costing money the Soviet treasury increasingly didn't have, and costing lives the Soviet public increasingly resented. It also cost something harder to measure: legitimacy. The war made the USSR a target of international pressure and sanctions, deepening its isolation at the exact moment it desperately needed friends, trade, and capital. By the time Soviet troops finally withdrew in 1989, the war had drained the military budget, damaged morale at home, and further starved an economy already gasping from the oil collapse. The empire was now bleeding from two wounds at once, and it was about to hand the scalpel to the one man who thought he could still save it. In 1985, a new leader took charge of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Gorbachev understood something his predecessors hadn't wanted to admit. The system, as it stood, could not survive much longer, so he launched two sweeping reforms. The first was perestroika, restructuring, an attempt to loosen the grip of central planning, allow limited market mechanisms, and modernize a stagnant economy. The second was glasnost, openness, a dramatic loosening of censorship and political control, allowing citizens, journalists, and even officials to speak more freely than at any point in Soviet history. Gorbachev's intention was to save the Soviet Union by fixing it from within. But openness is a strange kind of medicine. Once people were allowed to speak freely, they didn't just talk about factory efficiency. They talked about famines the government had hidden, corruption at every level, decades of lies. For the first time, ordinary citizens could see clearly just how far the system had fallen behind and how much they'd been told that wasn't true. The reforms meant to repair the Soviet Union's legitimacy ended up doing the opposite. They didn't fix the cracks, they shone a spotlight directly into them. Once the truth was out in the open, things moved fast. Across the Soviet republics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, Georgia, and beyond, independence movements that had simmered for decades erupted into open political action. If the center was this weak, this exposed, why stay? At the same time, the economy was falling apart in real time. Inflation soared, the ruble became nearly worthless. Savings that citizens had built over a lifetime evaporated within months. Supply chains that connected factories across 15 republics, designed for a single unified state, broke down as those republics pulled away from each other. In August 1991, hardline communist officials attempted a coup to reverse the reforms and hold the union together by force. It failed within days, a final desperate sign of just how little control the center still had. By December 1991, one republic after another formally declared independence. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. A superpower that had stood for nearly 70 years was gone, not conquered, but dissolved. The Soviet Union did not lose because it lacked power. It had the land, it had the military, it had the resources of an entire continent. What it didn't have was an economy that could keep pace with its own ambitions, one honest enough to admit its problems, and flexible enough to fix them before the pressure became unbearable. In the end, it wasn't a war that brought down the Soviet Union. It was arithmetic.